speak up really loudly right there. That's the meeting microphone and also the speaker and the camera. So that's what everybody sees online. So you got to kind of speak up. For those people that are online viewing today's meeting, when it comes to comment time, if you like, we're going to keep everybody muted. If you'd like to make a comment, you can click the raised hand icon for the chair to recognize you for a comment when that comes to time. Otherwise, keep your mics muted, please. Also in the chat, please read.
Other things to do. Not going to
Have microphones. If you need one, there's a microphone. So if you don't need it, don't worry about it. If you do need one, you can grab it, hit the button. You should come through the speakers. So, and I'll let Stephanie and Dale know. I'll watch you back, see if we can't hear you, and let you know. Okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Great, thank
you.
Well, call the meeting of the Environmental Rules Review Committee to order. First in-person meeting in quite some time. And we will kick off with a roll call. You'll handle the roll call. Dave recommended is that maybe because we do have some new faces for in-person, we just, say who you are and introduce yourself as you do the roll call.
Sounds good.
So go ahead.
And we'll start with you, Rob.
Okay, Rob Naderhood. I am chair of the committee. Good to be here in person and see everybody again.
And Melissa Stoll.
Hi, everybody. I'm here present. Melissa Missy Stoltz from the city of Ann Arbor.
And Shayna Berry.
Present. Shupian from Kalamazoo.
City.
Present, Fighting Murad, Farmington House.
And Grant.
Grant Trigger for the general public.
And Chuck.
President, I'm Chuck Lipster. I'm president of the Michigan Agribusiness Association of Lansing, here on behalf of a statewide agricultural organization.
Great. And Walker.
Walker Motive, president, Bell's Brewery, small business representative from Kalamazoo.
And Dave.
Dave Manus, representing the oil and gas industry at a small family business up in Mount Pleasant, Michigan.
Okay. So we have absent today Helen Taylor and also Eric Passel couldn't make it. He's last minute. Also, I saw online we have Jeremy Orr.
Yep, Jeremy Orr, representing environmental organizations in Detroit, present.
Okay.
Dale. Mary Ellen.
Yeah.
Is that too? Yep.
Yep, Mary Ellen.
Yep, so present and representing manufacturing in Michigan.
Great.
And from Grand Rapids, Steelcase, but also live in Grand Haven.
Great. And I think that is everybody. Just to explain quorum, Jeremy, because you're not in the room, we can't count you towards quorum. So we do have quorum today. We have everybody but 3 so present in the room. So we do have quorum to continue. Also, I did want to open it up to also our other members. So we have James Cliff.
Present online here. Ingham County.
Johnson, are you with us?
This is Laura Dowd sitting in for Jim Johnson in Ingham County.
Welcome. And Trevor?
Trevor's here. Representing the Department of Natural Resources. Good to see you guys.
Thank you. And is Gerald with us? Gerald Tiernan?
Present, sorry.
Great. Represents DHHS. All right, so that should summarize it. Also in the room, we have Bob Reichel. He represents the committee from the Attorney General's office. You saw him.
While we're finishing up the roll call, I did want to just take a moment to thank two of our committee members who are in some really unforeseen circumstances. This will be their last meeting with us as their terms are expiring on October 4th. So Shayna Berry has served us for the last several years representing the waste management industry, and Grant Trigger, who was one of the original appointees to the committee several years ago representing the general public. So I just want to thank you both for your willingness to serve on the committee, and the time and effort that you put into this, and your thoughtfulness and diligence and helping the committee make our decisions and discharge our duties. So you both definitely be missed. So thank you very much for your service. Okay, on to the next item, the approval of the agenda. I have the agenda in front of you. Someone wants to make a motion to approve today's agenda?
I move to approve today's agenda.
Okay.
I'll second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right, the agenda is approved. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the committee's minutes from April 28th, 2021, which are in your meeting packet as well. Is everyone view those? And I would accept a motion to approve the minutes of the April 28th meeting.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor of approving the minutes from April 28th, say aye.
Aye.
Oh, do we? Okay. Go ahead. Roll call vote.
Roll call on this one. Rob?
Yes.
Okay. Missy?
Yes.
Alright. Shayna? Yes. Mary Ellen? Denise?
Yes.
Okay. Grant?
Yes.
Chuck?
Yes.
Walker?
Yes.
And
Yes.
alright, thank you.
Okay, the minutes of the April 28th meeting are approved. So on to the new business here. We have a presentation from the Trace McDonald from the Air Quality Division is going to give us a presentation on the rule set 2021-24. So Trace, thank you for being here today. I'll turn it over to you.
All right.
Just a second, give me a second just to load your presentation.
I have all my materials in case you guys ask tough questions.
Got the binder.
Yeah,
Ready to
big
go.
binder and clean air out.
All the answers.
Okay, should be loading. And then I'll just hand it to me after you're done and do the fix.
Okay. So you're going to advance the slides for me? All right, my name is Trace McDonald. I'm with the Air Quality Division of Eagle, and I'm in their SIP development unit. SIP stands for a lot today. So we're the group that do a lot of the rulemaking for air quality. Today, my colleague in all school, Ryan Carley, was not available to make it. He didn't want to slow down the process though, so he entrusted me with the presentation. So we'll see if I can answer any questions that he might have been a little better prepared for. But I think he's taught me a lot over the last few years, so I think I can probably answer a lot of the questions for him. All right, so on the agenda, we're going to go, I want to go over a little bit of background, give you some context for these rules, and a little bit of a summary. I might hop around a little bit as I whittle down the amount of rules we have. There seems like there's a lot of changes to focus in on the salient rules that we of interest. We'll talk about our engagement with stakeholders. We'll go through a little bit of the rule, outline the rules a little bit for you, and then talk about the regulatory impact statement, and then take questions, although I wouldn't mind if you ask questions along the way. It's up to you. All right, so let's go to the background. The Clean Air Act requires, as one component, something called the good neighbor provisions. Those are some rules that, or some regulations that would say that we are responsible to make sure not to allow pollutants from our state to transport to another state and affect their ability to keep up with the NAQS standards, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So this good neighbor provision is kind of the basis of everything in Part 8, almost all of the rules in Part 8 right now. So knowing the history of these regulations will kind of explain why we're making the changes we're making. In 1998, EPA finalized something called the NOx SIP call, and it was to address the transport of pollutants that cause ozone in other states. The two pollutants that cause, the two primary criteria pollutants that cause ozone in the atmosphere are nitrogen oxides, or NOx, and VOCs, volatile organic compounds. In this case, this regulation was really meant to obviously target just the NOx. In 2003, EPA helped create the NOx budget trading program, and that's a cap and trade program. And in this case, it affected EGUs, electrical generating units, or what we call power plants, and a handful of non-EGUs. In other words, large combustion sources that don't necessarily create electricity, but they're a pretty significant source of NOx. They're the minority as compared to the EGUs. If anyone's not familiar with the cap and trade program, just very simply put is there's a cap on some subgroup. In this case, it's the state of Michigan is the subgroup. They don't really care there's allocations, and you can buy, sell, or trade those allocations within that subgroup. And so in this case, cap and trade was Michigan, and all of these EGUs and non-EGUs were the group that can trade these allocations around. And in 2009, the NOx budget trading program. Oh, by the way, we created rules within our rule book. In 2000, we created rules in 2003 in order to do one component where the state of Michigan was allowed to distribute those allocations within our state. And then in 2009, however, the Clean Air Interstate Rule came into being, and that replaced the NOx budget trading program. So we created a few more rules doing the same thing, where we were allowed to manipulate those allocations around. Then in 2015, the CARE program, by the way, had some issues with it, and after it got sorted out through the court system, EPA came up with the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, or what I call CASPR. It replaced CARE. We didn't create any rules for the CASPR program because we just left it in the hands of EPA. We talked with stakeholders. There was no consensus as to whether or not they wanted us to have that ability, and so they seemed satisfied with letting EPA run the program, unlike the previous two programs, the CARE program and the MPGP. However, a little difference with the CASPR program was that while it included all of the EGUs, the electrical generating units, it did not include the non-EGUs. At that time, they just gave us some guidance as to what to do with those non-EGUs, but they didn't give us any mechanism to run those programs. Finally, in 2019, they actually finalized a rule that told us what we could do with our state implementation plans to address those requirements of the NOx call for those non-EGUs. And really, they just want us to keep to that statewide budget. Next slide. So now I'll talk about the rule package itself, and we'll kind of break it down a little bit. Rule 801 was kind of the general rule that basically said everybody in the state of Michigan that's a big combustion source has to have a certain standard. However, if you're subject to something else, you don't have to do Rule 801. So it's the combustion sources, the large combustion sources that are not in the NOx tip call effectively. Rules 802, 803, and 810 are the rules that we have for the NOx tip call 90 GUs. And Rule 818 is for large internal combustion engines. These are the three groups of rules that we're going to edit, that we're proposing to edit here. The rules that we're going to rescind include Rule 802A. It's a housekeeping rule. We just basically, every time we do a rulemaking process where we open a new part, we've started taking all of the, what they call incorporate by reference, where we just refer to a federal regulation or some other regulation. We had them all dispersed throughout all of our parts in our rules, but we decided to put them all in Rule 902. And so this has been a slow process. You may have actually been involved in some other rulemakings where we did this very thing. Rules 804 through 809, 811 through 816, that's that NOx budget trading program, that first program we talked about. We don't need those rules anymore because we now have Casper and these the other rules that we're talking about today. Rule 817 is a housekeeping rule. There's just no sources anymore. It's Portland cement kilns. There's none in Michigan, and even if there were, we have a federal regulation that is more stringent than the rule we have, so we just don't need it. Rule 821 through 834 are the care rules that we talked about. Again, we don't need those anymore because Casper is taking care of those sources along with the rules 802, 803, and 810. Okay. Now I'm going to go on and talk real briefly about stakeholders to give you some idea of who this impacts. So Rule 801, I did a little research when we first started this, and the large combustion sources that weren't caught up in the NOx call or in the Casper program, there's only about 14 of them. You can see the names on the slide if you want. They're some of the larger sources in Michigan, at least for NOx. Rule 802, 803, and 810, the non-EGUs affect 7 sources. Again, you can see those, and those we're very sure about. 14 in Rule 801, there may be 1 or 2 missing. I don't think so, but we polled all of my colleagues and looked through all of our paperwork and databases, and that's what we came up with. That's probably fairly accurate. Rule 818, large internal combustion engines, I found 3 sources subject to that. Again, pretty confident that we got all 3 of those. It's not a highly utilized rule. Just in general, the number of sources here might seem a little small. It's because they're relatively big sources of NOx. And I think the trend over time for companies has been to, rather than get 1 large unit, they would rather have 2 smaller units for flexibility. They may be doing it to avoid these regulations, but I kind of doubt it. I have a feeling it's more about flexibility to the companies. And so as these units get older and older and they take them offline and replace them with something else, they may not be subject to any of these Part 8 rules that we're discussing. So these numbers trending downward for sure. They're probably fewer and fewer over time. Okay, so as far as stakeholder engagement, for Rule 801, since we only have a handful of sources, it's pretty convenient for us. So we actually, I emailed, found contacts for 14 facilities, emailed them, and had a few phone conversations. Of course, when some of the facilities received those, they didn't quite understand what we were asking. We sent them draft rules to look at. Again, and with Rule 802, 803, 810, those 7 facilities, there's a lot more engagement because those changes were a little more significant. We had multiple meetings, both virtual and in person, and conference calls. I've kept them apprised of progress in emails. We actually started back in 2015 when all of this started with the Casper program. We started talking about it, but we didn't get real serious about the changes until 2019 when that final rule came from EPA. The Rule 818, again, 3 facilities, so the engagement was just email contact. Maybe one of them called me, but we basically had no comments about 801 and 818, and I'll explain why. Very few comments from those draft rules. And I think we only started that in like 2020 because we knew, go ahead to the next slide. The Rule 801 and 818 really were minor impacts. With Rule 801, we eliminated some antiquated language. We modified the applicability language to make it more understandable. As these programs have changed, there was kind of some, creative rule wording that we don't need anymore. So we just kind of simplified the applicability language, didn't change the applicability in any way that we were aware of. We did some miscellaneous housekeeping. So there's effectively no impact on the facilities, and that's why we got no comments from them. We basically just sent it out to them to make sure that we didn't accidentally change applicability because we had no intention to. And we just wanted them to kind of help us verify that. Same thing with Rule 818, we didn't even do that much. We just really eliminated some antiquated language, miscellaneous housekeeping, like I was talking about, moving those, incorporate by reference. Those references had to be updated, things like that. No impact on facilities. So the next rules, 802 and 803, and this is part of the 802, 803, 810, and this is where we get into some little bit more significant changes. 802 applicability, we changed the wording so it narrowed the applicability to mean just the subject non-EGUs. Basically, it was actually just to make it clearer again. It didn't actually change who was applicable. So part of this process has been encouraged by EPA. They're trying to give us this program. They're not a call program they don't want anymore. So they want to give it to us. We have given them drafts of these rules as well to look at. And when they saw this, when they saw our rules, they suggested that we do a couple of these changes that I'm going to talk about in this slide. One of them was making it clear that these rules are only the non-EGUs are subject to these rules. So that's kind of why we did it. Again, it's just a clarification, doesn't change any applicability. Everything should stay the same. We eliminated some antiquated language and miscellaneous housekeeping again with these. Rule 803 is a bunch of definitions. And so again, based on a comment from EPA, references to definitions that were in federal regulations, and since they kind of want to break ties with their program, they asked that we put all of the definitions so we didn't have our rules referring to their rules. And so we ended up adding a lot of definitions to our rule. But again, that shouldn't change anything, right? We eliminated the antiquated language and the miscellaneous housekeeping. So then on to Rule 810. So here's where the more significant changes occurred as far as editing goes. Here's where the non-EGUs we're shifting that program over to us. So now we are going to establish the budget, although we have to stick to the number that the state of Michigan is capped at. We will modify it and we will track it. And it's called a budget. We're not really tracking. We've tried to use some creative language and we refer to them as benchmark allocations. Or, I'm sorry, benchmark apportionments. We try to avoid the word allocations because an allocation means that you're specifically giving them a chunk of these NOx emissions. And we're not really doing that because it's not really a trading program per se. It's that we wanted to create these benchmarks so that effectively they would know when something, if we exceed our allotment for Michigan, then we know who to go back to look at and say who has emitted more than we anticipated. So they will still report, or now they will report their emissions to Air Quality Division instead of what's called CAMD, Clean Air Markets Division of EPA. And they'll submit that to us every November 1st. The other big bonus here is that the facilities now will have a second monitoring option. Right now, they have to monitor under a federal regulation of 40 CFR 75, and it's controlled, I guess, for lack of a better term, by EPA. And if they want to have alternatives, if they want to discuss things, they kind of have to go through EPA. EPA is not very responsive to them. This is a relatively minor program to them, so they have not found that they're getting some of the feedback they need from EPA, which is again why EPA wants to give it to us. We can then open up a second monitoring option under 40 CFR 60 that is, I'm told by we confirmed with our air quality staff that it's just as robust as Part 75. They feel very confident. Matter of fact, they were very encouraging of this ability to test under the second monitoring system. And so that now we can be more responsive to these 7 facilities in the state. And again, we feel confident that the quality of the monitoring is again, it's just another federal standard. There just happens to be a couple of them. Again, it's not exactly my area of expertise. But if you ask some questions, I might be able to try to answer those about the monitoring specifically. So again, we go back to, so what does this all mean? If they have, basically, if they report their actual emissions, and we're going to compare them to these benchmark apportionments that we've created, and only if we collectively go over Michigan's limit will that trigger anything for these facilities to do. And then that's when we're going to look at the benchmarks, see who's exceeded those benchmarks, and then they'll be required to submit to us the reason why they did, what they're going to do to stop that from happening again, that sort of thing. And we'll have to work with EPA when that does happen. Yes.
Could you clarify who sets the standards in the budgets? Because it wasn't clear to me reviewing this. Are you saying that the feds establish the state allocation? You then establish the budgets for individual sources, and there's no regulatory implication in any of this unless the collective discharges in Michigan exceed the federal set standard.
You described it well. Yep. That's we're not calling them budgets just because there's not a number to trade. There's really no demand. I'll show you in the next slide. There's really no demand, so there's no trading. But yes, we are going to establish those. And in the rule, there is some verbiage in the rule where we talk about what kind of things we're going to use to establish those values. And we've already have some draft values that we've discussed with facilities. And they're based on things like permit limits for facilities that have permits, for physical constraints of the equipment, things like that. So we have kind of a loose methodology put in the rule for generating these benchmarks. But again, like you said, nothing will occur unless we've collectively exceeded the 2,200. Well, you'll see the number in the next slide is 2,200 tons.
How did the cross-state issue get resolved in this, such that when you're looking at an allocation, it's releases from sources in Michigan, not an evaluation of what's in the air, but rather what's being discharged? And is that how they got away from the cross-state transfer problem?
No, there's still a cross-state transfer problem. It's just being handled
regulatory wise, not that it doesn't exist, but from a regulatory standpoint, I remember the dispute about what states were getting their burden because other states were causing more of a problem.
Right.
That issue is what I meant.
Yeah, see, and so that's where the non-SIP call was kind of an early generation of that. And as they continue with the CARE program and the CASPER, and they've actually revised the CASPER twice, now they had the CASPER update and now the revised CASPER update. And every time they update those allocations as budgets for, again, the EGUs now, not covered by these rules, they are doing new modeling to try to figure out which state is affecting which, and then they're ratcheting down their budgets based on that. But these, again, for some reason, EPA decided between CARE and CASPER to drop the non-EGUs, but we still had some obligation because of the non-SIP call to make sure that we're maintaining some sort of oversight of those sources. However, because it's a 20-year-old regulation, we've kind of advanced so far beyond those levels that they're just not very effective based on that old regulation. I mean, and they've chosen not to rescind the regulation. I guess they probably could, but EPA hasn't, so therefore we still have that obligation to address it. It's just not very effective. We have other tools in our toolkits now that we would use if a new source came in and got a permit. They would probably be emitting at a much lower value based on best available control technology or reasonable available control technology, or other programs would cause them to keep their limit or keep their emissions much lower than this regulation would. So and so actually one more thing, there is one scenario, however, that an individual company may still ask, we may ask them if they go over their individual benchmark, even if the collective has not, if they are located in an ozone non-attainment area. So we did want to have a little more oversight of the sources that happen to be in areas where we're having troubles with ozone, and so that we have that information and react to it. We want to make sure that they contacted us. Yes.
But are there specific areas in the state and specific users that might be affected by that? And if so, who?
Yes, there are a couple areas in the state. We have 3 small areas on the west side, and all of southeast Michigan right now is considered an ozone non-attainment, and that would Therefore, the current ozone non-attainment area, and there's not a new standard, so I suspect this will either stay the same or maybe decrease over time as we go into attainment. But there are two sources, yes, the University of Michigan is in Washtenaw County and Marathon is in Wayne County.
Okay, thank you.
Two sources would potentially have to report if they exceed their benchmark allocation.
Just quickly, how frequently does EPA reassess the state's law?
They will not.
They will
This program is done to them. They do that as part of the CASPER program. And where they're going to revisit it is they ratchet down the CASPER program. So again, the CASPER program has already been ratcheted down a couple of times, and it's going to affect the EGUs.
These are the non-EGUs.
These are the non-EGUs. Now someday, maybe the next version of CASPER may draw them back in. But as of right now,
Tracy, there is a connection between this program and the CASPER program that covers EGUs, right? So the cap that CASPER program imposed on the state of Michigan, there is an indirect impact as you provide a budget for the non-EGUs. The EGU cap or benchmark, if that's the right terminology, will be ratcheted down, right? So is there an indirect impact here of this rule since CASPER is driving the cap for the state?
I would assume that when they modeled for CASPER, they allotted a certain amount for non-EGUs, and it's probably based on this number. And that they must have found that it wasn't significant enough for them to worry about including it in the program. Again, that's all speculation. Does that answer your question?
Well, no, I was looking at the impacts. If you have considered all the impacts and rather than just looking at the non-EGUs and their budget, benchmark budget, that's extrapolated from the CASPER budget, which set up essentially for EGUs. Is that's what I
don't know. I'm not sure. Still not clear on what you're asking.
Well, since the CASPER program doesn't cover non-EGUs, it's only for EGUs.
Yes.
I'm assuming that the cap that will be imposed in the state of Michigan was targeted toward EGUs. So based on historical operations of EGUs or
CASPER. Yes, CASPER has an existing cap for the CASPER sources. Yes.
So that defines the state of Michigan cap, right? So you're taking a portion of that allowance, if you want to call it that, and apply it to the non-EGUs.
No.
Okay.
They are kept separate at this point.
Okay.
Again, I'm guessing that the CASPER, the effects and the way they came up with the CASPER budget probably included non-EGUs in the formulation, but no, the CASPER budget is the CASPER budget for EGUs, and it has no connection to the non-EGUs in this budget. Other than maybe how the CASPER budget was originally created as part of its modeling, is my guess, my assumption.
So how do you determine whether collectively you exceeded?
We're just looking at collectively just the non-EGUs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if we go to the next slide, it might help a little bit. You'll see we have the 7 sources with their, and I know that's small, if you can't see that, it might be in your packets. But you can see that over the past 8 years, that collectively these 7 sources have emitted around 200 to 300 tons. And the non-EGU allotment is 2,200 tons. So you're talking around 15% of the cap that has been given to us by EPA. So as long as those facilities don't generate more than 2,200 tons, there's no reason to think that they would have to take the steps in this rule, other than if individually they're in a non-attainment area, U of M and Marathon, and if they individually go over their individual budgets that we established. Yeah.
Go ahead, Mary.
Oh, okay. Yeah, to that point, I'm just curious about Marathon Petroleum's emissions in 2019. Why it's so much higher?
Yeah, and you see Michigan State had one as well in 2016. So back to that monitoring system, when I said 40 CFR 75, what they have there is, in that monitoring program, is a very draconian data substitution method. So if their monitor goes down, they have to look back at the worst number they had for a certain amount of time, and then they have to use that number and assume that it's always emitting at that worst case number. there's absolutely no reason to believe that it actually emitted that at that level, because that's just, this equipment is operated better than that. They would not have operated. That's happened to both Marathon, where they had a little bit of monitor downtime, and at MSU. Part of the nice things about 40 CFR 60 monitoring is the data substitution is a little more realistic. And so we probably wouldn't see these unnatural spikes that, even with the spikes, you can see we're still nowhere near the cap. But yeah, it's a very, very, very conservative data substitution policy that created those numbers.
Trace, when determining the benchmarks for each of the sources, are you going off of sort of historical, or are you saying, you know, just to take an example, you know, University of Michigan, you were 9% of the total, so we're gonna, your benchmarks or your limit's gonna be 9% of 2209.
Nope. What we've managed to do is, so some of those units that you see there are obviously not used much. They're basically backup. I think the one for Corteva used to be owned by Dow. You can see they barely used it, but they're actually quite large units, but they just haven't needed to fire up those boilers. They actually just, those emissions are really just from starting it up here and there to make sure it keeps working. So they actually have a high potential. So what we've done is we've proposed to these individuals, and this is part of our conversation with the 7 companies involved, is that we calculate what we call a PTE, potential to emit. So basically, what is it, the most that they could legally emit based on either a federally enforceable permit to install that they've received from Air Quality Division, or physical constraints of the equipment. So it may not match up very well with their actual emissions, because so Corteva, for example, is a very old pieces of equipment, and they're quite large, and so they actually have a fairly high potential to emit because they don't have a permit that has limited that in some way. Unlike, say, graphics packaging just got a new permit just recently, and that number is quite low. So even though the size is, there's not necessarily correspondence with the size. It's basically what corresponds with just what the company has done in the last 15 years with regards to permitting, or again, what they're burning, the fuel they're burning, or again, some physical constraint of the size of the equipment. And so that's how, and so when we came up with we have a PTE for each one of these sources. And if you, in theory, if every one of those sources emitted at their PTE, which is either a federally enforceable permit condition or their just physical limit, we would still only have 1,600 tons of emissions. So they'd still meet this 2,200 ton cap, roughly 1,600. So again, not much of a limit, or if a facility exceeds their permit to install, our idea is, again, there's just newer tools in our toolbox to deal with that. If they exceed a permit condition, then they're going to be, in trouble with our inspectors. We have a system for dealing with that. This is not the right tool to try to address those facilities that exceed their permit limits, basically.
So is that benchmark for each facility going to be that PTE number?
Yes. Yeah, that's at least that's what we've drafted so far. Yeah.
And it sounds like, just to confirm, but it's an ongoing conversation with the sources in terms of, you're engaged with all of them, and you're having these conversations about what makes sense.
Very clear cut with facilities that have permits to install. I mean, I can look in their permit and see if they have 46 tons per year. I can do the math and give you a PTE from that federally enforceable condition. Some of them don't necessarily have those limits in their permits, and so that gets a little harder to do the calculation. But yes, so we're seeing, let's say we're within a few significant digits of establishing those PTEs.
So one last question. So this is basically the budget. If you base it on PTE relative to that 2209 number, you may be left with some, or maybe may exceed it. But what happened in the situation where you have new sources coming online?
Well, that's what we're saying, is that even if, in theory, if all of these companies emitted their absolute maximum, they still have 1,600 tons. We'd still have a 600 ton buffer
That's set aside for new
That's
sources.
new source set aside is what we're calling it. And then as any of these companies make any changes, we will change those numbers to add to that new source set aside. Or if any of these companies get new sources, we would of course take them out of that new source set aside bank, let's call it. However, I can tell you that I looked back and I'm going to say in 10 or 12 years, I think maybe one source has come in to the state of Michigan that would fit into this category. And don't even quote me on that, there might not even be one. So this is not an area we expect companies to be adding facilities to. I don't see that as being a problem. And if anything, in general, every time they get a new permit, they come in for permitting, again, our system usually ratchets them down a little bit. And so, as a matter of fact, I told you Graphics Packaging just got a permit very recently, and I'm going to change their PTE down. So a few more allocated, or a few more benchmark apportionments will go over to the new source set aside. We're just trying to avoid that language because it has a certain meaning, the allocation, something. So because that's why we use the creative benchmark apportionment phrasing.
So it would appear from this table that when it comes to contributing NOx emissions, University of Michigan is doing better than Michigan State University.
Go Google it.
Quite a size difference.
Yep. I spoken with, I'm an alum, so I definitely have a little pride here that our numbers are low, yeah. Any other questions? That's it for me.
I had,
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot, there's one more slide.
well, my question's on that, so go ahead.
Oh, okay. So just a quick summary. In that regulatory impact statement, I was just trying my best to kind of convey this information. The EPA is the one who wants to give us this program. There's no changes that have occurred to applicability of any sources. Stakeholders are involved throughout the process. We're really getting more local control of this program. And with very little effort on our part now. I'll maintain these values, but as we pointed out, they're not likely to change by just a small amount. I mean, once a year, I'll spend 2 hours probably updating them. So, and our stack testing people, same thing. They're happy to do this work. They do this work already. They're encouraging of it. And as far as environmental impact, again, unfortunately, it's an old regulation. So the good news is there's no negative impact, but I guess the bad news is there's no positive environmental impact because there's really just this isn't the right tool for lowering NOx emissions. Unfortunately, fortunately we have other tools, but this is not the right one to be using for that. So again, it's a push when it comes to environmental impact. Okay, now I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I did have one question on the regulatory impact statement. There's some language in there that says that the sources are currently incurring additional costs to maintain the equipment and procedures necessary to meet the EPA's monitoring requirements. It says as they seek to repair and replace monitoring these more stringent requirements, they're paying a considerable additional cost. I guess I was just trying to understand if, I don't know if you were involved in drafting the regulatory impact statement, but just in general, is there a compliance benefit? Will this reduce costs? If they take advantage of some of the alternative monitoring, is that sort of a cost savings for the sources, or is it cost neutral to them?
I don't entirely, this is my understanding, I guess, to take it with that caveat. 40 CFR 75 requires the tolerances of the monitoring equipment are very tight. The 40 CFR 60, I believe, they're not quite as tight of tolerances. In talking to our staff, they had no reservations about having these companies switch from 75 to 60 because they feel the quality. They know they've been to all these facilities, they've seen the stack tests, they've evaluated 75 and 60 stack tests, and so I take them at their word that there's no reduction in quality. However, the equipment that they have to use, they're called SEMs, continuous emission monitoring systems, apparently are much more expensive if you, in other words, they just, again, the tolerances are smaller, so the equipment costs a lot more to be meeting a 40 CFR 75 regulation. And so as this equipment gets old and they have to replace it, matter of fact, unfortunately, we're a little behind. I think a few of these companies have already had to make these kinds of decisions about what they want to do. They've been asking for this change for a couple of years now because they're trying to have some sort of cost savings in this equipment they have to buy in order to meet the monitoring requirements for these rules. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, so the replacement monitoring equipment that comes online will be potentially less expensive because there's a little more wiggle room in the tolerances. Okay.
Yes.
But we also feel confident it's not sacrificing quality.
Correct. That's according to our staff. They had no reservations. Again, they've encouraged us to do this and to get that local control so that they can look the alternatives and things like that because they're confident that the values are good. And we're talking about some pretty large emitters, and I don't think. As a matter of fact, at one point when I asked, let's just say, just to throw out some numbers, let's say that part 75 has to be within 10% accuracy, and part 60 has to be within 20% accuracy. These companies are hitting 5% accuracy all the time. It's just that kind of helped me, get my arms around the question here. So like, that equipment to get that 10% accuracy is, costs $100,000 more than the equipment to get the 20% accuracy. But again, they're not having any problems keeping our stack test people happy.
Okay, any other questions for Trace?
Trace wants to administer this program, no impact with respect to resources or systems or anything like that would be required to administer this program?
For us?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's basically just be something I'll spend a little time on each year, but they won't pay me any more for it unless they. I'll lobby for that. I see my boss is on there, so we can ask. I don't think so.
Great. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you, Trace. Really appreciate it. Deb, did you want to make the one note about the rules?
Yeah.
Just as we consider that stuff with respect to the rules, there's one point that I wanted to make.
Yeah, everybody should have a minor draft rule change document in front of them. If not, there's some by the door, and I'm going to pull up the presentation slides for those online really quick. Well, really quick for me. Okay, so for those online, this should be loading in just a second. All right. Okay, so while prepping for today's meeting yesterday, we discovered a minor change that we need to make to the draft rules that we want to present to you and have a vote on. And basically what it is we had to change the order number or letters in front of the definitions as we created new draft rules. And one of the references didn't get updated to the correct definition in the body. So all we want to do simply is to take the reference of the old O and just update it to the new reference of R in the definition section. So it shouldn't cause any kind of confusion. But I'm really glad that they caught that yesterday just in time. It was perfect timing. So if that is okay with the committee, we'd like to do a motion to accept this change.
So I think we could probably do it when we take a vote on the rules. So we just note that we are approving them or making a decision on them as changed here, right?
Well, Well, since I presented to you last week a different draft of the rules, I do want to take a motion and just make sure that we're okay with this change before it goes to COR, because this is going to be different than what we presented to you today to vote on.
I see what you're saying, but I think can we cover that if we make a motion, just cover it in that motion. Like,
Okay.
a vote, you know what I mean?
Consolidated.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep, that should be fine. Okay. Is there any questions on this? Okay, great, thank you. Or is there any questions online? I should also ask if anyone online has any questions. All right.
Okay, good.
We're good.
All right. Let's move on to the next agenda item, which is public comment. So we will run through public comment by folks on the phone, on the video here, or in-person participants. And I think we have the general policy of limiting those to 3 minutes, if I recall. So I don't know how we're handling those, but I guess first up would be public comment by anyone on the phone.
Hey Jim, how do they unmute their phone if they want to make a public comment?
Yeah, I think it's pound 2. Is anybody hearing anymore?
Well, we have one person that is called in with a phone number. So I just want to make sure that they're not.
If you're on the phone, you should be getting instructions when you dial in. They'll tell you how to do that.
Okay.
I
So,
think it might be pound 2.
okay.
Are we able, so the person on the phone would show up on the Teams meeting, right? As a phone number or not?
It is a phone number on the Teams meeting.
I don't know, are you able to like unmute that or?
Star 6. Star 6.
Star
Star
6.
6.
So,
Mutes and unmutes. Star 6.
Okay.
so if the person that called in on the phone wants to make a public comment, hit star 6 to unmute yourself. And they unmute.
I have no comment, but thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do we have any folks on the video? Just to raise hands. I'm not sure where to see that. Do you see it at all, Dale?
Yeah, I
Okay.
can see it, and I do
Maybe
not see anyone that is raising their hand. So if you are online joining us via Teams and you'd like to make a public comment, go ahead and raise your hand or just start talking. All right.
Not hearing anyone on Teams that wishes to make a comment? Okay.
No hands are raised.
All right. Is there anyone in person that would like to make a public comment? Okay. Hearing none, then we will we'll close the public comment and we'll move on to deliberation on the rule set by the committee. So I'll open up the floor if anyone has any thoughts or comments on next steps. Yeah, I think most of us have now been through the process for my APA here, but the process in terms of what the committee's options are. You know, we've been provided with the rules. We are to evaluate them according to the 4 criteria that are set forth in the APA, and you know, our options are really to this would require a vote of 9 voting members, which is I think everyone here, right, in person, can make a determination that that the draft rules can proceed under the sort of off-ramp option where the rules will just sort of go out from the purview of the ERC and proceed through the rulemaking process. By a majority vote of the voting members of the committee, can make a determination that the draft proposed rules meet the criteria in the APA and may proceed to a public hearing. Or we have the option of, by a majority vote, determining that the draft rules don't meet the criteria or that additional review is needed, additional information is needed. So those are sort of the three routes that the committee can take now that we've received and reviewed the rules. And so again, the criteria are that the draft proposed rules reasonably implement and apply the statute authorizing the rulemaking and are consistent with other applicable law, that the draft rules are necessary and suitable to achieve their purposes in proportion to the burdens they place on individuals and businesses, that the draft rules are as clear and unambiguous as reasonably appropriate, considering the subject matter of the proposed rules and the individuals and businesses that will be required to comply with the proposed rules, and finally, that the draft proposed rules are based on sound and objective scientific reasoning. So those are the, just a reminder of the criteria by which the committee is supposed to evaluate the rules. So, as I said, now I'll open it up for any comments or thoughts any of the committee members have. No, thanks. You had it up there.
Yeah.
Rob, my thoughts as I kind of look at the 5 criteria that it seems to me that the proposed rules meet all 5 of the criteria that are laid out there. I don't know if you want a motion right now or we just want to talk about it some more, but I'd be happy to make a motion if we need to get things going.
Second, Dave, that my questions were answered in the presentation, and so it feels like everything has been checked.
Okay. A lot of support for that. So if you want to make a motion.
Sure. Based on the review of the 5 criteria listed that you just kind of walked through and we have on the screen, I'd make a motion that we determine that the request, according to the language in the rules here, our guidelines, doesn't proceed any further under this section, but proceeds under other wise applicable sections of the Act. So basically, the off-ramp looks like, as far as I'm concerned, looks like they did their job. They can go forward. I was very encouraged by a couple of, well, let's make the motion, then I'll make some comments.
Okay.
Can I have one friendly amendment, which is as modified?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I would concur with that. Thank you, Ms. Lee.
Yeah, with the modification. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so we have a motion on the table.
Yeah, just a couple of points. One, I was very encouraged with the reaching out to the stakeholders that would be impacted. I think that's critical that happen, especially in a case like this where there's so few. Why not talk to the folks that are going to be dealing with it? And they seem, from what we testimony or the comments we heard today, they seem fine with it. And the other thing is, I'm encouraged by the state of Michigan pulling things in when they're able to from the EPA. I think it's just, we're certainly seeing in our industry, if we can bring rules that the state administers, it's much more beneficial to the local industries. And the state of Michigan has clearly demonstrated that they can manage these programs. I think that's a trend that we ought to, just in general, is a good way to go. So those are my.
Good. Yeah, I agree. I think, it's kind of rare to have the proposed regulation change that, stakeholders clearly benefit from and are on board with, the staff, the department staff sees it as an improvement. You've got additional flexibility for the regulated community, and like you said, a little more local control. So I think in addition to hitting the criteria, it just sort of checks all the boxes of what I think probably we're aiming for with our regulatory systems.
one other side note that I really appreciate is just because we can omit doesn't mean we should omit. And so the fact that in reaching out to state, the process was really, really great, but I also appreciated hearing as permits come back up, we are still making sure to go with state of our technology and what's appropriate today. So I just applaud the department for working on.
Yeah, and I believe, if I understood that correctly, the provisions to really focus on emission unit and non-integrated areas that you look at this, so that the environmental benefit come from that. So I echo this is
Any other discussion on the motion?
Can I clarify the motion real quick?
Sure.
So we do not want the rules to come back to the ERC after the public.
Yes, I vote that we implement 5A in our.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Call the question then, and we can vote on the motion to handle these rules under section 5A in determining that the rules will proceed under the otherwise applicable sections of the Act, or as modified by the tweak that Dale noted. All right, so should we do a roll call? Maybe we should, because we need unanimous approval. Let's do a roll call vote.
Who seconded that?
We didn't actually have a second.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I will second it now. Yes, I would like to second the motion.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let's go roll call. So Rob,
Yes.
Melissa,
Yes.
Shayna,
Yes.
Mary Ellen,
Yes.
Deep,
yes.
Grant,
You see?
Grant,
Yes, please. Yes.
Chuck,
Yes.
Walker,
Yes.
and Dave.
Yes.
Okay. Motion passes, so the rules will leave our purview and proceed under the other applicable sections of the Administrative Procedures Act. That was very efficient, so thanks everybody for your consideration and efforts in making the trip today to do this work. So with that, I'll accept a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Yeah, Shana will second it. I will make the motion to adjourn as my last.
Before we adjourn, just
Yes.
a question about the calendar. Are we still planning for the remainder of this year to be the fourth Thursday that we talked about, or are we gonna, how are we looking at our calendar for this year? And then if you guys thought about a calendar for next year?
Actually, that is a really good point. Can we agree on next year's calendar while we're here, just in case we do not have another meeting the rest of this year?
We've had it in the past where we scheduled them, and if there wasn't anything to go package, so we cancel those, but at least put them on the calendar.
So we can,
I'm very comfortable with doing it on the fourth Thursday like we have been. I think Walker, it works out better for you to do it 12, as I recall.
That is correct, yes.
Yeah, so I'd be all in favor of doing it, and we're putting it on the calendar for the fourth Thursday at 12 o'clock. That's just a thought, get it up there and then adjust it as we need to.
yep, for the next calendar
I
year.
have no
Fourth
yeah,
Thursday.
no problem with that from my perspective.
The third Thursday or fourth? We have been doing it the third. Yeah,
We have been doing it on the 3rd?
Yeah.
Okay.
just
that's
to
fine.
clarify. Okay.
That's great. Stick with the status
A little
quo.
preference for status quo.
And we said one,
Do we want to do a motion for that?
12.
Or set
Noon.
the agenda?
I think noon works better for most time.
I'll just-
We're talking about noon.
Yeah, I don't have a preference. one way or the other.
I don't have a preference, so.
Noon is fine.
Okay.
Don't we already have it on our calendars?
We do through the rest of this calendar year, but next calendar year we do not.
Are you 100% sure? Because I do. Dun, dun, dun.
Maybe that just-
Artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I know.
Maybe that's where we were gonna go.
Watch out for Apple.
Well, I guess if Dale can take a look and see what we've got, that'd be
Yeah.
fine, then just communicate it out to
Yeah.
us. So
If we don't have it, then I'll do it.
get it on our calendars, so that would be helpful. I've got another organization, we were talking about calendars today,
So
so
we do that.
if this helps.
She's
All
right.
right.
No, we do.
It's rare.
All right.
Something like that.
I just have to add this room then.
All right.
Sounds good. Anything else before we adjourn? Okay. Nothing, I'll accept the motion to adjourn the meeting. Yeah, great.
Motion to adjourn.
Second, I'm especially here, thank
That's the last
you.
word if she seconds the motion to adjourn.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, man. Being a part of getting out of this thing. Jason, over here.